There is a particular silence that follows a woman being discarded in public. It is not the silence of shock. People recover from shock quickly enough. It is the silence of everyone present calculating what they owe the moment and deciding, almost uniformly, that they owe it nothing. That silence settled over the trade square of Dunmore on a cold Wednesday afternoon, and it stayed there like frost on a fence rail, and nobody moved to break it. The bond coach from the Eastern Road had come in just past second bell. 4 passengers stepped off: a seed merchant, 2 lumber assessors with matching coats, and then, last, with the careful descent of someone who knows the ground beneath them is not guaranteed, the orc. She was tall. That was the first thing, not towering in the way of the war-bred clans from the Ashridge Mountains, but tall enough that the coach door had required her to bow her head, and tall enough that every person on that square registered her before she had both feet on the dust. Her skin was the green of deep pine shadow. Her tusks, what remained of them, had been filed to the gum line, flat and blunt, the way a clan marks its exiles so that every orc who ever looks at her mouth will know she has been cut loose. On her left cheek, running from the hinge of her jaw to the ridge of her cheekbone, 3 parallel scars sat pale against the green. Clan brands. Burned in, not cut. The kind of marks that are given in front of witnesses so that the shame has an audience. She carried a single bag, hide, not cloth, with a drawstring that had been repaired more than once. She wore a dress that had been pressed before the journey. Someone had taken an iron to it with care, and the journey had undone every bit of that care, and she had let it. Because there was only so much a person could hold together at once, and she had chosen her spine over her hem. Her name was Ushka. She had been Ushka of the Grimjaw. Now she was Ushka of nothing, which is what exile makes of you. Harlan Brake was waiting on the far side of the square. He stood near the water trough, with a folded bond contract in his coat and the particular expression of a man who had been composing his retreat for weeks and had only succeeded in making the retreat worse for the rehearsal. He was not a large man. Sandy-haired, slope-shouldered, the kind of build that suggests a life spent near a desk or a counter rather than a plow. He had filed the bond 8 months ago through Aldworth and Clay, the agency that brokered matches between the races when no one else would touch the work. 32 marks of blood silver, nearly a year's wage, paid in full because the idea of an orc bride had appealed to him in the abstract the way many ideas appeal to men who do not think past the appeal. 8 months of neighbors finding out. 8 months of comments at the tavern shifting from jokes to something quieter. 8 months for a man without much spine to discover how little he had. He had written no letter, because a letter would have required him to put his cowardice into sentences, and sentences stare back. So he had come to the square instead, and when the orc woman stepped off the bond coach, he looked at her the way a man looks at the consequence of his own choices when the consequence has a face, and instead of bearing the weight, he set it down. "I can't go through with this," he said it loud. That was the whole of the cruelty, not the words but the volume. Loud enough for Eldecroft at the dry goods window, and Tom Barrack at the feed store, and the women at the well who had come for water and stayed for the spectacle. By supper half the town would know. By morning, the rest. Ushka stood and let him finish, hands at her sides, chin level, her face doing what she needed it to do, which was nothing. She had spent 23 years in a world that took things from her, tusks, clan marks, her mother's name struck from the Grimjaw rolls the same day hers was, because that is what clans do to the families of the exiled. She had learned that the moment you give an audience your pain is the moment your pain stops belonging to you. Harlan held up the bond contract, broker's paper, agency seal, both signatures. He held it the way a man holds a deed, though every soul on that square knew a woman was not land. Then he folded the papers, put them in his coat, and walked toward the livery without looking back. The square emptied the way public places empty after a private humiliation. The slow, embarrassed drift of people who have seen something they will talk about later, but do not wish to be seen seeing. And Ushka stood where she was, bag at her feet. The town in front of her, timber-fronted buildings, a rutted road, the smell of horse and cook smoke, and no clear answer to what came next. The last of her coin had gone to the bond coach fare. No return passage. No name to speak to anyone within 100 miles. She was standing in a human settlement with filed tusks and exile brands and a bag that held everything she owned. And the world was not large. Across the street, a man came out of the hardware and feed store carrying a paper sack of iron fittings and stopped on the boardwalk step. Calden Voss. 32 years old, broad in the shoulders, wheat chaff on his sleeves, scarred knuckles from carpentry, and rough work in equal measure. He had the look of a man who had been carrying weight long enough that the carrying had become the way he stood and breathed, and who had stopped mentioning the weight because mentioning it did not make it lighter. His wife, Aneth, had died 2 winters ago. The fever had taken 11 days to kill her, and the house had gone quiet in the way houses go quiet when the person who made the noise is gone. He had 2 children, 40 acres of bottomland that needed more hands than he had, and a kitchen that functioned inside a home that did not. He knew the difference. He stood on the boardwalk step and read the square. The bag, the straight back, the empty space where a man had just been. The exile scars that meant something he only half understood, but understood enough. A woman alone in a place that was not hers, holding herself together with nothing but the decision to hold herself together. Calden set the sack of fittings on the step, the way a man sets something down when he has decided that whatever comes next is more important. He crossed the street and stopped at the bottom of the square's wooden steps and looked up at her. She looked down at him. Green face, filed tusks, exile brands, the full weight of what she was and what had been done to her, all of it visible, none of it hidden. Seth Calden, he said, then corrected himself with the slight shake of a man who has been alone long enough that introductions feel unfamiliar. Calden Voss. I've got 2 children and a farmhouse that needs keeping. 3 days a week I do carpentry jobs in town, so mornings you'd have the place to yourself. He held her gaze. He did not look at her tusks. He did not look at her scars. He looked at her eyes, which were amber and steady, and watching him with the particular attention of someone who has been deceived before and is measuring the distance between what a person says and what a person means. It's temporary, he said. Room and board until you've sorted what comes next. She studied him. Not the way a human woman studies a man. Orcs read different things. She was looking at his hands, because hands tell you what a man does when no one is asking him to do it. She was looking at his shoulders, because shoulders tell you what a man carries. She was looking at whether his eyes moved when he spoke, because eyes that move are eyes that are calculating, and eyes that stay are eyes that have already done their calculation and are standing by the result. Can you cook? He said. For 3? Something moved in her face. Not a smile. Orcs do not smile the way humans do, and Ushka had not smiled in the way of anyone for a very long time. But something shifted, a degree of tension leaving, or a degree of recognition arriving. I can, she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, with the faint gravel of someone who has not spoken much in recent days. And I'm not afraid of hard work. She picked up her bag. Then let's go, she said. They walked off the square together, the broad-shouldered human farmer and the tall, green-skinned orc woman with the exile brands, and behind them the town of Dunmore stored it up for later, because Dunmore always did. The farm sat a quarter-mile from the edge of town, where the valley floor began its slow tilt toward the eastern hills. 40 acres of bottomland, wheat and root crops mostly, with a kitchen garden gone to seed along the south side of the house and a horse pen holding a single draft mare who watched them come up the road with the uncomplicated interest of an animal that has no opinions about the affairs of people. The house was timber-framed, single-story, with a porch that ran the width of the front and a chimney putting out a thin line of smoke that meant someone had banked the stove before leaving. One of the porch steps, the second from the bottom, was loose. It gave under Calden's boot when he went up, and he stepped over it with the automatic habit of a man who has been stepping over the same broken thing for long enough that the stepping over has become part of the routine. Ushka noted the step. She did not comment on it. Inside, the front room was clean. That was the first thing she registered. It was clean in the way of a house managed by a man alone. Functional, ordered, the floor had been swept recently. The table had been wiped, the wood box was full. But there was nothing soft in the room. No curtain at the window, no cloth on the table, no color anywhere that had not arrived by accident. A workbench ran along the far wall, organized with the careful precision of a man who respects his tools, and a cast iron stove sat in the center of the room, doing its steady, indifferent work. On the shelf above the kitchen window sat a small sewing basket with a wooden lid. It had the look of something no one had touched in a long time. The dust on the lid was the even kind, not the dust of neglect, but the dust of agreement. Everyone in this house had quietly decided to leave it where it was, and the leaving had gone on long enough that the basket had become part of the shelf the way a scar becomes part of a face. "Room off the kitchen is yours," Calden said, gesturing with his chin. "Your own door. Your own space. The children eat at 6. I eat when I'm back." He said it plainly, the way he had said everything so far. Without decoration, without apology, without the particular carefulness that people use when they are trying to make something sound better than it is. Ushka respected that. A man who tells you the terms without gilding them is a man who intends to keep them. She set her bag inside the small room. A cot, a window, a hook on the back of the door, and when she came back out, the boy was standing in the hall. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens when Ushka meets the children, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories coming. Now, back to Ushka. Rowan Voss. 10 years old. His father's build was already declaring itself in the shoulders and the square set of the jaw. His hair was dark and fell across his forehead in the way of a boy who has no one to tell him to push it back and has not thought to do it himself. He had the face of a child who keeps his own counsel, not sullen, not hostile, but closed. Closed in the way of a door that has been shut from the inside by someone who is not sure yet whether the person on the other side is worth opening it for. He looked at Ushka. He looked at the green skin, the filed tusks, the exile brands on her cheek. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have seen a version of before. Another woman in this kitchen. Another stranger meant to fill the space his mother left and are not ready to feel differently about. He looked at his father. Then he turned and went back down the hall without a word, and the silence he left behind him said everything the word would have. Calden watched him go. Something moved in his jaw, a tightening, a setting, and then he turned to the stove and busied himself with the fire. And neither he nor Ushka mentioned what had just happened, because some things do not improve with discussion. Fern did not make an entrance. She materialized. 6 years old. Brown hair in 2 braids, one tied properly and one held by a ribbon that had given up and was simply hanging, waiting to fall. She appeared in the bedroom doorway with the complete and unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to want things quietly. Everything Fern wanted, she wanted with her entire face. And right now, her entire face wanted to understand the tall green woman standing in the kitchen. She stared at Ushka. Ushka looked back, steady, even, nothing performed. "Your teeth are broken," Fern said. "Fern," Calden's voice, from the stove. Ushka lowered herself to one knee. It brought her face level with the girls, and this close the exile scars were impossible to miss. and Fern did not miss them. "They're not broken," Ushka said. "They were taken from me." Fern considered this with the absolute seriousness of a 6-year-old encountering new information. Did it hurt? Yes, a lot? Yes, Fern thought about this. Then, with the logic of a child who has processed a fact and moved on to the next order of business, "Are you going to live here?" "For a while." "Okay." Fern looked at Ushka's hands, large, green, scarred across the knuckles. "Your hands are big." "They are." "Can you braid hair?" "I can." Fern reached up and touched the ribbon that was falling. This one came out. Ushka retied the ribbon. Her fingers, thick, blunt-nailed, built for work that humans would call rough, moved with a care that did not match their appearance. Fern held still and let her, and when the ribbon was secure, she patted it once with satisfaction and looked at Ushka with the expression of a child who has made a preliminary assessment and found it acceptable. Calden at the stove had watched this without turning around. He did not need to turn around. He could hear it, and hearing was enough, and what he heard moved something in him that he set carefully aside because he was not ready to look at it. The larder was thin. Dry beans. Cornmeal, lard, a sorry onion. Salt, a half jar of preserved tomatoes. A bone cracked for marrow. This was not a larder that invited ambition. It was a larder that said surviving has been enough. Ushka had grown up in a Grimjaw cook tent. Orc cooking is not delicate, but it is resourceful in ways human kitchens rarely need to be. She had learned from the oldest cook in the clan, a one-armed female named Gruka, who had lost the arm in a forge accident and transferred all her considerable force into a wooden spoon, and a cast iron pot, and a tongue that could strip bark at 40 paces. She took the bone, the beans, found wild garlic along the back fence. From her bag she took a small cloth pouch, the only thing she had carried out of Grimjaw lands, a blend of dried spices that smelled like smoke and iron and campfires she would not see again. She cooked. Orc cooking does not whisper. It announces. The spices hit the heat, and the marrow broke down into the broth, and the wild garlic opened up. And inside 20 minutes, the kitchen smelled like a place where someone had decided that the people eating here deserved more than survival. It was not a large thing, what she was doing. She was making food. But she was making food the way Gruka had taught her, as an act of purpose, not of obligation. And the difference between the two is the difference between a fire that warms a room and a fire that simply burns. The smell reached the front room before anyone sat down. It moved through the house the way certain smells do, not announcing itself, not demanding attention, but arriving so completely that by the time you noticed it, it had already changed the temperature of the room. Calden came in from the yard and stopped just inside the door. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the frame, and something crossed his face, not surprise, not exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has forgotten what a certain kind of warmth feels like, and is remembering it now, and does not trust the memory. Supper was a broth made from the marrow bone and the beans and the wild garlic, and a measure of the Grimjaw spice, served over the cornmeal, cooked down to a thick, smooth porridge. It had no business being what it was given what the larder had held. The transformation was not dramatic. It was not a feast. But it was the difference between food that sustains and food that someone has thought about. And that difference, in a house that had been running on plain survival for 2 years, was not small. They ate at the table. Calden at the head. Rowan on his left, silent, eating with his eyes on his bowl. Fern on his right, eating with her eyes moving between her bowl and Ushka in a steady rotation, cataloging everything. Ushka at the far end, eating the way she did everything, calmly, without performance. Halfway through the meal, Fern set her spoon down and looked at Ushka with the directness that only children and orcs share, and said, "The last woman who kept house for us burned everything she touched." Fern. Calden. Again, Fern looked at Ushka instead of her father. which told Ushka something about who this child had already decided to address. She did, though. Burnt food is a serious matter, Ushka said, eyes on her plate. I don't take it lightly. Across the table, Rowan looked up. The corner of his mouth moved, a single, involuntary twitch that traveled from one side to the other and was suppressed before it could become anything as definitive as a smile. He said nothing. He went back to his bowl. But when the meal was finished and the bowls were cleared, he stayed at the table longer than he needed to, not helping, not speaking, just staying. And Calden noted this the way he noted the weather and the fences and the slow turning of seasons. Quietly, without comment. Filing it in the place where a man keeps the things that matter too much to talk about. Ushka went to the general store on the third day. Salt, thread, lard, the copper marks Calden had left on the counter. Pell Haddon, behind the counter, had the long face and longer memory of a man who treats information as currency. Two women near the fabric bolts stopped talking when Ushka came through the door. She set the goods on the counter, placed the marks beside them, one at a time. Pell looked at the marks. These from Voss? They are. He did not move to wrap them. Heard Breck turned you back. He did. He looked at her, green skin, exile brands, filed tusks, the calm face of a woman who has been stared at by experts and will not flinch for an amateur. He wrapped the goods, took the marks, did not say thank you, did not say come again. The omission was precise. Ushka walked home and said nothing about it to Calden. She had been assessed by people with prepared faces in enough rooms to have built a patience for it that did not require tending. But she noticed, walking home in the thin afternoon light, that no one on the street said hello, and the absence of warmth has its own temperature. It was the following morning, the fourth day, when Calden came off the porch and the loose step held solid under his boot. He stopped. He pressed it again with his full weight. He stepped back up and stepped down, and the board did not move. He crouched and looked at the underside and found new nails set clean and flush into the support beam, driven with the kind of force that no human woman he had ever known could have managed with a standard hammer. The work was precise. Orc hands, orc strength, applied with a care that the strength did not require, but the care insisted upon. He went inside. He poured 2 cups of the hot black grain brew that passed for coffee in this part of the valley. He set one on the counter near where Ushka was working, not next to her, not in her space, just near enough that the gesture was clear and far enough that it was not an imposition. Nothing was said about the step. Nothing was said about the coffee. They drank in the early quiet while the cold morning pressed against the windows and the stove worked, and the house held its silence around them, and the silence was not empty. It was the silence of 2 people who have understood something about each other and have decided, independently and without discussion, that the understanding does not need to be spoken to be real. Outside, the valley stretched east toward the hills, and the sky was the color of unpolished tin, and the first frost of the season was coming, and neither of them knew yet how much that frost would change. But something else was coming too. From the far end of town, in the room above the dry goods store where Harlan Brick rented his quarters, a man sat on the edge of his bed with a bond contract in his hand, and a pride that had been sitting wrong since the square. And the sitting wrong was getting worse by the day, and he had not yet decided what to do about it. But he was beginning to. And at the Voss farm, in the back room where a 10-year-old boy lay in his bed with his face to the wall, Rowan stared at the dark and thought about the sound of his sister laughing at supper. Actually laughing. The startled kind. The kind that escapes before you can catch it. And he thought about the way the tall green woman had moved through the kitchen. And he thought about the step that was fixed, and he did not know what to do with any of it. And not knowing sat in his chest like a fist, and he was 10 years old, and no one had told him what to do with a fist like that. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. Wind in the pines. The mare shifting in her pen. The stove ticking as the metal cooled. And somewhere east, past the tree line, past the ridge where the valley ended and the wild country began, somewhere out there in the dark, a sound moved through the cold air. Low, brief, the single note of a horn made from hollowed bone. An orc horn. It sounded once, and then the night was quiet again, and no one in the house heard it. Not yet. Rowan tested her on the 5th day. It was not a dramatic test. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no slammed door. A 10-year-old boy who has learned to survive without a mother does not test people with noise. He tests them with stillness. He tests them by doing nothing and watching to see what kind of nothing comes back. Ushka had asked him to bring in the firewood. The pile was stacked along the back wall of the house, split logs, mostly pine, with some harder oak mixed in that Caldon had traded a carpentry job for, and the wood box inside was nearly empty, and the evening was coming on cold, and bringing in the wood was the kind of task that did not require discussion. Rowan did not bring in the wood. He sat at the kitchen table with a piece of whittling in his hands. A block of soft pine he had been working into a shape that might have been a horse, or might have been a dog, or might have been nothing at all, and he sat there and carved and waited. He was not waiting for the wood to bring itself in. He was waiting to see what Ushka would do, whether she would shout, the way the woman before her had shouted, whether she would complain to his father, the way the woman before that had done, whether she would do the task herself and say nothing, which would mean she was weak, or whether she would do something else entirely, which was the thing he had not yet seen and was not sure he believed in. Ushka appeared in the doorway of the back room. She did not fill the doorway the way a human would. She occupied it, her shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame, her head a hand's width from the lintel. She stood there and looked at Rowan at the table, and Rowan looked back, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the moment had weight. Rowan. The wood. He did not look away. I was getting to it. I know. Her voice was even. No anger in it, no pleading, no threat. Just the flat, steady surface of a woman who has said what she means and means what she has said. Get to it now, please. The please was not a concession. It was not softness. It was the word of a person who respects the one she is speaking to enough to include it, and who expects the respect to be returned, and who will stand in this doorway as long as the standing requires. Rowan held her gaze. He was looking for something. Not defiance, not dominance, not the 100 small manipulations that adults perform on children when they want obedience without earning it. He was looking for ground. Solid ground. The kind that does not shift when you put your weight on it. The kind his mother had been. He found it. He set down the whittling, got up, went outside, and brought in the wood. 3 armloads. He stacked it in the box without being told how, because he knew how, and when he was done, he stood there for a moment with wood dust on his sleeves. "Thank you," Ushka said. Plainly, without performance. Rowan went back to his whittling. In the front room, behind the half-closed door to his workbench space, Caldon had heard every word. He set his plane down on the bench and stood in the quiet for a while, not thinking exactly, but letting something settle that had been unsettled for a long time. And then he picked the plane back up and went back to work, and the sound of the blade on wood was the only sound in the house for a long time after that. The wolves came on a night when the moon was half and the cold had teeth. Caldon was 2 miles out, mending fence on the far acres. Ushka heard the chickens first, not the ordinary fuss, but the sharp, frantic racket of animals that have smelled something with claws. She was on her feet before the second cry. She took the hatchet from beside the woodbox, short-handled, heavy-headed, designed for kindling, and about to be asked to do something considerably more ambitious. 2 shapes moved along the coop fence, low, fluid, the color of smoke against frozen grass. Valley wolves, lean and opportunistic. Ushka walked toward them with the hatchet in her right hand, made herself large, let the moonlight catch the green of her skin. Wolves do not know what an orc is, but they know what something bigger and unafraid looks like. The first broke left. The second came at the fence, testing. Ushka brought the hatchet handle down on the rail, the crack split the night. The first wolf pulled back. The second did not. It lunged for a gap in the rotted fence. Ushka stepped into the gap. Its claws raked her forearm, 3 lines, fast and hot, and she caught the animal across the skull with the flat of the hatchet. Not hard enough to kill, hard enough to change its mind. Both wolves went low through the grass and into the tree line and were gone. She stood at the fence with blood on her arm and the cold burning in her lungs. She waited until the yard was quiet, went inside, wrapped her arm with clean cloth, and went to bed without waking anyone. In the morning, Rowan found Ushka at the counter with the cloth on her arm spotted rust-colored. He stopped. This was not scraped knee blood. This was a grown woman with claw marks on her arm making breakfast as though the marks were not there, and the matter-of-factness of it hit him somewhere he had not expected. Your arm. The first time he had spoken to her directly. Are you okay? I'm fine. What happened? Wolves came for the coop. Did you kill them? No. Convinced them to leave. He nodded once and sat down, and the quality of his silence had changed. No longer a closed door. A door left on the latch. Calden found the scratches on the fence rail and the blood on the ground. He came inside. Saw the cloth on Ushka's arm. Wolves came, she said, not looking up. I see that. That evening, after the children were in bed, he replaced every board on the coop fence, reinforced the gate, sank the posts deeper. He did not tell Ushka he was doing it. She heard the hammer from her room and knew. The days found their rhythm the way water finds the low places in a field. Steady, patient, inevitable. Rowan started staying at the table after meals. He simply stopped leaving, which for a boy who had spent 2 years leaving every room she entered was not a small thing. He would sit with his whittling, present in a way he had not been before, not participating exactly, but no longer refusing to be there. Calden saw it and said nothing. Fern became Ushka's shadow, one day following at a distance, the next beside her, the next underfoot, the next essential. She helped where she could reach and watched where she couldn't. One evening, Ushka sat by the stove and told Fern a Grimjaw story, an old one, about a warrior who lost her sword and had to cross a mountain range with nothing but her hands and her stubbornness. The mountain kept changing shape. The warrior kept walking because walking was all she knew when everything else was gone. Ushka did the voices without embarrassment. The warriors low and roughed up, the mountains slow and amused, the winds sharp and untrustworthy. Fern pressed against her side, fingers wrapped in Ushka's sleeve. At the far end of the room, Rowan sat with his whittling, knife still. He did not look up. He did not leave. Calden leaned in the doorway and listened and felt something in his chest that was not grief and was not joy and did not have a name. There was a night past midnight when Calden woke restless and found the back door ajar. Ushka was on the porch, sitting on the top step with a thin blanket from her bag, looking at the tree line. The dark was the thick kind you can feel on your skin, and she sat in it without a lamp and without movement. Around her neck, where a clan pendant should have been, the bone and iron token every Grimjaw wears from birth until death, there was only a leather cord with nothing on it, worn smooth. She touched it the way a person touches a scar. Now, if you're still here, do me a favor, drop a comment about what you think Ushka's clan did that got her banished. I've seen some wild theories, and I love reading them. And if you haven't already, that subscribe button is right there. All right, back to the porch. Calden stood in the doorway. He did not step out. He did not sit beside her. He stood where he was and looked at the back of her head and the line of her shoulders and the cord around her neck with nothing hanging from it. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "Some nights I can't." A silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that two people share when they have been in the same house long enough that the silence between them has started to feel like a room they both know how to be in. Calden turned to go back inside. At the door, without turning around, gets cold on that porch. There's a heavier blanket in the hall closet. Second shelf. He went back to bed. Ushka sat for a while longer, looking at the dark, touching the empty cord. Then she went inside and found the blanket. Wool. Thick. The kind of blanket a man keeps because someone he loved once picked it out, and she wrapped it around herself and went back to her room and lay in the dark and thought about kitchens and coffee and mended steps and the weight of a blanket that had been offered without being asked for. She slept. The morning it happened was gray and cold and ordinary in every way. There was nothing about it that announced itself. No particular quality to the light, no shift in the wind. Just a Thursday in late autumn with frost on the windows and the stove going, and the smell of oat porridge, and the quiet industry of a house that has found its rhythm and is running on it. Fern was in the kitchen in her socks, conducting her ragdoll Pip on a tour that involved serious whispered conversation. She caught her foot on the threshold and went down hard on both palms. The startled cry, the calculation, the tears. Ushka was on the floor before the crying had fully started. Not rushing, not fussing. Just coming down with the steady certainty of a woman who has decided that the most important thing right now is two small hands. She took those hands and turned them over, red, scraped, stinging, and held them in her own large green hands and said nothing and went nowhere. Fern looked at the green hands, the amber eyes, the exile scars, the face of the person who was here, who was always here, who had come down to the floor without being asked. And Fern, without deciding to say it, said the word that was simply true. "Mama." It went into the kitchen and did not leave. Ushka's hands stayed where they were. One breath, the terrible tenderness of being given a name you have not asked for by someone who does not know what the giving costs. She gathered Fern in and held her until the crying ran itself out, which did not take long, because the crying had never really been about the fall. Calden was in the bedroom doorway. He had been getting dressed. He had heard the fall, and the crying, and then the word, and the word had stopped him the way a hand on the chest stops a man who is about to walk into something he cannot walk back from. He stood with one hand on the doorframe and looked at the hallway floor and did not move. Something was working in him, something large and unfinished and too close to the surface, and he kept his face turned away from it, because some things change the moment you look at them straight, and he was not sure he was ready for the change. At the table, Rowan had gone still. His knife was in his right hand. The half-carved horse was in his left. He was not carving. He was sitting perfectly still with the expression of a boy who has heard something that has reached past every wall he has built and touched the thing the walls were protecting, and the thing is awake now, and he does not know what it will do. He was 10 years old. He knew what the word meant. He knew what it meant that Fern had said it. He knew what it meant that Ushka had not corrected her. And somewhere in his face, in the tight line of his mouth, in the set of his jaw, in the eyes that were his father's eyes, something that had been closed for a long time was working, slowly and painfully, toward open. Calden went back into his room. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hands flat on his knees and stayed there while the morning moved around him. The light came through the window and fell across the floor in the thin, angled way of late autumn light, and he sat in it and thought about his wife, who had been dead 2 years, and who had been the first person to hold Fern, and the first person Fern had called by that name, and who would have understood, he was certain she would have understood, what had just happened in the kitchen, and would not have been diminished by it. she would have been glad. He knew this about her. It was one of the things he held on to when the holding was hard. The house let its breath go. The word stayed where it was. Nobody spoke about it. Nobody needed to. The word had done its work, and the work was not the kind that requires discussion. 3 days later, Rowan came home from school with a split lip and a scrape across his cheekbone, and the particular expression of a boy who has been in a fight he did not start and is not sure he won. Calden sat him down at the kitchen table and dipped a cloth in warm water and cleaned the scrape, while Rowan looked at the far wall and said nothing. The silence between them was the old kind, father and son, the language of men who have been communicating without words for long enough that the not speaking has become its own dialect. "Who?" Calden said. Rowan did not answer. Rowan, Gareth Dunn. The name came out flat, stripped of everything but the consonants. And Will Haddon. 2 of them? Rowan shrugged, which was not an answer, but was the only answer he was willing to give. Calden cleaned the cloth. He did not ask the question he wanted to ask, because he already knew the answer, and asking it would have meant making Rowan say it, and making Rowan say it would have been its own kind of cruelty. The Dunn boy was Margaret Dunn's son. The Haddon boy was Pell Haddon's, Pell, who ran the general store and had looked at Ushka's copper marks like they were contaminated. Ushka came through the kitchen on her way to the back porch. She had an armload of clean linens she had pulled from the line. She saw Rowan's face. She stopped. Rowan looked up at her. For the first time, the actual first time since she had arrived, he looked at her directly, without the careful distance he had been maintaining, without the wall. Just a boy with a split lip and a scrape on his face, and something in his eyes that was not anger and was not pain, but was the raw, bewildered hurt of a child who is trying to defend something he has not fully admitted he loves and does not have the words for the defense. They said. His voice caught. He swallowed. They said, Yura, that you're not. He couldn't finish. Ushka set the linens on the counter. She did not move closer. She did not touch him. She stood where she was, at the distance his pride required, and looked at him with the steadiness that was the thing she had. The thing she had always had. The thing the clan had not been able to take when they took everything else. You don't have to know what to say to them, she said. You just have to know what you know. Rowan looked at her. The tears he was not crying were visible in the tightness of his throat and the set of his jaw, and he held them where they were because he was 10 years old and his father was right there, and crying was not something he was ready to do in front of either of them. I hit Gareth, he said. I heard. He fell down. I imagine he did. Rowan looked at the table. He swallowed again. Then he looked back up at Ushka, and whatever crossed his face in that moment was not the face of a boy who tolerates a stranger in his house. It was the face of a boy who has fought for someone and is beginning to understand why. That evening, at supper, Rowan pulled his chair to the other side of the table and sat beside Ushka. He did not announce it. He did not explain it. He sat down and ate his meal with the split lip darkening and the scrape on his cheek beginning to scab, and the steady, settled silence of a boy who has made a decision and sees no need to discuss it. Fern noticed. She looked at her brother's new position at the table, and then she looked at Ushka. And then she looked back at Rowan, and something in her face, some private calculation that only a 6-year-old could perform, resolved itself, and she smiled, and went back to her food. Calden looked at his son. He looked at Ushka. He looked at his plate. And he ate his supper and said nothing, and the nothing was full, and the table had 4 people at it who were beginning to look like the thing they had been too careful to call themselves. Marta Selwyn found Ushka at the general store counter on a Friday. Her husband ran the grain exchange. Her opinions ran the town. People are talking, Marta said with rehearsed concern. An orc woman under the roof of a human man with his children, the wrong kind of attachment can do real harm. I say this with kindness. The arrangement has gone on long enough. Ushka picked up her flower and walked home. 25 years old, stripped of her name by the Grimjaw Council, reduced to a transaction by a bond broker, discarded on a square by a man without courage, and now assessed by a woman with a prepared voice. The patience she had built was not brittle, it was load-bearing. She understood that another person's measure of her was not the truth. The truth was in the kitchen she kept, the children she fed, the wolves she had driven off, the word a 6-year-old had given her. She stood at the kitchen window longer than she needed to. Then she started supper. That evening, Calden fed the fire while she finished the dishes. "You all right?" he said, not looking up. "I am." He nodded. She went back to the dishes. The quiet held. The frost came early that year, the hard kind, the kind that turns the ground to iron. The last of the season's wheat was still in the field, 3 acres. Calden came inside at dusk with his face set. "Frost tonight. Hard one. If the wheat's not in by morning, we lose it." He did not say what losing it meant. Ushka had been managing the larder for weeks. She knew. How many hours? All of them. Between them, the stove worked, and the kitchen smelled like bread, and the children sat at the table, and the whole warm interior of the life they had built, without naming it, sat between them like something made of glass. "I'll get my boots," she said. They worked through the night. The cold went through clothing and into the muscle and stayed. Calden cut, bound, stacked, carried, the mechanical rhythm of a man who has done this his whole life. His hands were numb within the first hour. Ushka worked beside him, and she did not work like a human. Orc strength is not a metaphor. She lifted sheaves that Calden needed both arms for with one hand. She carried loads that would have broken a human woman's back and came back for more without slowing. Relentless the way a river is relentless, not trying to be strong, simply strong. By midnight, 2 acres cleared. By false dawn, the 3rd. The barn was full. The wheat was safe. Calden leaned against the barn door, breathing ragged. Ushka carried the last crate in, her hands split and bleeding from the cold, and set it down without acknowledging the blood. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know." The gray dawn sat between them, and something passed that was not a word, but was louder than most words. He went inside and made 3 cups, not 2. The 3rd he set at Ushka's place, which was a place now. Rowan came out with sleep in his eyes, drawn by the sound of the door. Calden's eyes moved to Ushka when she came in, and the looking carried something that had not been there at the start, and he did not look away from it. At the Broken Yoke Saloon on a Tuesday evening, Dale Marsh was narrating the Valley's affairs the way he always did. Guileless, enthusiastic. A man who finds the world interesting and assumes everyone else does too. The Voss place looked different, he said. Smoke at the right hours, fences tight, the boys steadier. And the orc woman, she had changed that house. The little girl had started calling her mama. Dale had heard it himself. At the end of the bar, Harlan Breck had gone still. He had the bond contract in his coat, carried it every day since the square. And now the picture was forming, warm windows, settled children, steady smoke. A girl saying mama to an orc woman who arrived on a contract with Harlan's name on the top line. His contract. His 32 marks. He set coins on the bar. Where does Voss live? Dale looked up, beginning to understand he had done something. Harlan walked out into the cold night, and the men at the bar knew something was coming and did not know how to stop it. Harlan Breck rode into Dunmore on a Thursday morning with the bond contract in his coat and the cold sun behind him, and the particular expression of a man who has convinced himself that what he is about to do is not what it looks like. He had spent 2 days at his rented rooms above the dry goods store. 2 days sitting on the edge of the bed with the bond contract on his knee. turning the idea over the way a man turns a coin he is not sure he wants to spend. The idea was simple, and it was ugly, and he knew it was ugly. Somewhere beneath the justifications, beneath the arithmetic of fees paid and contracts signed, he knew, and he did not care. Because the ugliness had been sitting in him since the day he walked off that square. And it had grown in the dark the way ugly things do, and the growing had made it feel like something other than ugliness. It had made it feel like a right. It had made it feel like justice. He had paid 32 marks of blood silver. He had signed a bond. The orc woman was contracted to him, his name on the first line, his signature at the bottom, his fee recorded in the margin. The fact that he had turned her away did not, in his accounting, dissolve the contract. The fact that she had found somewhere else to be did not, in his accounting, release his claim. The bond was paid. The bond was signed. And now the orc was keeping house for another man, and the town was talking about it with the warm approval that Harlan had never received for anything. And the children were calling her Mama, and the whole arrangement had the look of something that was settling into permanence. And permanence meant that Harlan's 32 marks of blood silver had purchased nothing, and Harlan Breck was not a man who could tolerate having purchased nothing. He found them coming out of the post office. Calden had gone to collect a timber notice, a standing order from the mill for framing lumber, the kind of small, steady work that kept the household running between harvest seasons. Ushka had walked with him because the children were at school and the morning had a shape now, and the shape included her walking to town with Calden. And neither of them had discussed this, and neither of them needed to. Harlan stepped into the middle of the street. He held the bond contract up, not folded this time, but open, the broker's seal and the signatures visible, the paper catching the morning light. He had rehearsed this. He had practiced the words in his room, standing in front of the mirror with the paper in his hand, and the rehearsal had given him a confidence that was thin and brittle and would not survive much pressure, but it was enough to get him to the middle of the street, and the street would have to do the rest. The fare was paid, he said. His voice was pitched to Carrie. The contract was signed. An obligation doesn't dissolve because a woman found somewhere more comfortable to be. He held the paper higher. She's bonded to me. My name, my marks, my claim. And then he used the word. He said his, not my bonded, not the contracted woman. He said my property, and the word property landed on the frozen street like a hammer on an anvil, and everybody heard it. Everything slowed. A woman near the dry goods window stopped walking. Two men outside the feed store turned. Pell Haddon came to his door with a rag in his hand and stood there. Marta Selwyn, who had been crossing to the well, stopped mid-stride and watched with the careful, cataloging attention of a woman who files events for future use. The cold air held everything in place. The street, the buildings, the thin winter sun, the man with the paper, and the two people in front of the post office, and the whole town watching from every window and doorway and boardwalk rail. Ushka stood beside Calden. She did not step back. She did not look at Harlan. She held herself the way she had held herself on the square that first day. Still, straight, unfinished, except that this time there was someone standing beside her, and the whole street could see that he had not moved. Calden looked at the paper. He looked at Harlan. His face did something that was not anger. Anger would have been easier. Anger would have been faster, but was something colder and more deliberate. The expression of a man who is calculating the cost of what he is about to do and has decided to pay it. He turned to Ushka. His voice was low and even, pitched only for her. Stay here. Not a command. The way you speak to someone you are coming back to. He walked to the house, not running. A man who runs looks desperate, and this was not desperation. This was the cold, clean movement of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. The way you execute a cut in wood, one pass, no hesitation, measure the cost afterward. 4 minutes there, 4 minutes back. He went inside and pulled up the loose floorboard in the bedroom. The one Ushka had heard creak at night and never asked about. The one the children had been told not to touch, and he took out the leather pouch underneath. 2 years of savings. Every mark of blood silver he had set aside since Aneth died. The slow, patient accumulation of a man rebuilding from the foundation up, saving toward more land, better stock, a future that had a shape he could almost see when he closed his eyes. Mornings in the cold. Carpentry jobs taken when he would rather have been home with his children. Meals where he ate less so they could eat more. Comforts deferred and deferred again until the deferring had become its own kind of discipline. 2 years of a man's life, compressed into a pouch of metal that fit in one hand and weighed almost nothing and weighed everything. He carried it back to the street. The town had not moved. Harlan had not moved. Ushka had not moved. The whole scene was frozen in the cold air, waiting for whatever would thaw it. Calden crossed the street. He took Harlan's hand, not roughly, not gently, just with the mechanical certainty of a man performing a transaction, and he pressed the pouch into it and held it there until Harlan's fingers closed around the weight. That settles the fare, the fee, and every excuse you rode in with. His voice was flat and final, the voice of a man who is not making a speech but is closing an account. It does not buy her. Nothing buys her. It frees her from you. Now go. Harlan looked at the money. He felt the weight, the 2 years, the mornings, the future deferred. He looked at the street looking at him. He looked once at Ushka, and whatever he found in her face was not what he had ridden into town for. There was no gratitude in it. No fear. No relief. There was the steady, amber gaze of a woman who has watched men try to own her for her entire life, and has outlasted every one of them, and will outlast this one too, and knows it. Harlan put the money in his coat. He walked to his horse. He mounted and rode north, and the sound of the hooves on the frozen road faded until it was gone, and the cold morning closed behind him like water. The street held its breath. And then Ushka spoke. She did not speak to the crowd. She did not speak to the memory of Harlan Breck riding away with another man's savings in his coat. She spoke to Calden, who was standing in front of her with empty hands and the particular exhaustion of a man who has just given away 2 years of his life and has not yet decided how he feels about it. That paper never made me his, she said. Her voice was quiet, but the street was quiet too. And the words carried the way true things carry. And you know that. Calden looked at her. But you left coffee on the counter and never asked about the step. You put a blanket in the closet and told me where it was. You mended the fence after the wolves and said nothing. You worked beside me in the frost and let me work beside you. She paused. The cold air moved between them. I made my choice a long time before this morning. I just hadn't said it out loud. Calden stood in front of her. The wind came off the eastern hills, clean and cold. He had crossed a street once before he had decided to. He had given away 2 years' worth of a future, and it had not felt like giving, it had felt like the only thing in the world he could do. Because standing by while she was taken was not something he was able to be. Then stay, he said. As my wife. If that's what you want. She looked at him. She took the space that choosing for yourself requires, the full, unhurried space that no one can give you and no one can take from you. And the cold street waited, and nobody hurried her, and the town watched, and the sky was white and still above it all. Yes, she said, quietly, completely, with nothing held back. That's what I want. His hand found hers and closed around it. His scarred fingers and her green ones, human and orc. 2 kinds of strength holding on. And the breath he let out was long and slow and carried in it the weight of every night he had spent alone in that house, listening to the silence where a family should have been. If this story has moved you, Share it with someone who needs it, and leave a comment telling me what moment hit you the hardest. Now let's see how this ends. Or doesn't. Around them, Dunmore came back to itself. Boots on the boardwalk. A door opening and falling shut. The wind off the hills, steady and clean. Marta Selwyn turned and walked to the well without comment, which was itself a kind of comment. Pelhadden went back inside his store. Tom Barrack looked at his boots and smiled and did not try to hide it. The ranch would have to wait. For the first time in years, waiting did not feel like losing. That evening the kitchen smelled like something with dark molasses, a new recipe Ushka was building from memory and invention, adjusting as she went. The kind of cooking that is not about following a plan, but about listening to what the ingredients want to do and letting them. Rowan was at the table with a short length of oak and his father's smallest hand plane, working the edge down by feel, the tip of his tongue between his teeth. The shape emerging from the wood was clear now. It was a horse, definitely a horse, and it was good work, patient and careful, the kind of work that announces something about the person doing it. Fern was on the floor with Pip, deep in some matter of considerable importance that did not require adult involvement and would not benefit from it. The door opened. Cold air and then Calden's boots on the step. The step that had been solid for weeks now. The step that neither of them mentioned. The sound of a man who knows his coming home is expected and has stopped taking that for granted. Fern raised Pip briefly in his direction by way of greeting and returned to her business. Rowan looked up at his father in the doorway. Then he looked back down at the plane and kept working. The looking had carried something in it, brief, quiet, certain, that had not been there at the start of things. It was the look of a boy who sees his father and knows that the seeing is mutual and does not need more than that. Calden hung his coat, crossed to the stove, stood beside Ushka and looked at what was on it. She moved the spoon toward him without a word. He tasted. Considered the slow, serious consideration of a man who has learned that this woman's cooking deserves his full attention. He looked at her. She took the spoon back. "I know," she said. "More molasses." The corner of his mouth moved. He went to hang his coat properly and left her to it. On the shelf above the kitchen window, the sewing basket sat where it had always sat. The late light came through the glass and found the wooden lid and rested there, warm and still. It did not look like something untouchable anymore. It looked like something that was waiting, not to be opened, but to be part of a room that had people in it again. It was past midnight when Ushka woke, not from a dream, from a sound, low, far away, carried on the wind from the east, from the ridge where the valley ended and the wild country began. A single note, held long, then cut short. A horn made from hollowed bone, an orc horn. She lay still in the dark. The house was quiet, Calden's breathing from the room they now shared, steady and deep. Fern's small sounds from her bed. The stove ticking. The ordinary music of a house at rest. The horn sounded again. Closer, Ushka rose without making a sound. She moved through the house the way she had moved through Grimjaw camps in the years before the exile, silent, deliberate, every step placed. She went to the back door and opened it and stepped onto the porch, and the cold hit her, and she stood in it and listened. The tree line was a black wall at the edge of the property. The pines stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, and beyond them the ridge climbed toward the wild country, and the wild country went on and on into territories that did not answer to human law or human maps. She listened. The wind moved through the pines. The horse shifted in the pen, restless. Animals know before people do. Then, she saw it. At the base of the nearest pine, where the property line met the tree shadow, something pale caught the thin moonlight. Ushka walked across the frozen yard in her bare feet, the cold biting into her soles, the grass stiff and sharp, and crouched at the tree line and picked it up. A bone. Small, carved, threaded on a cord of black sinew. A Grimjaw marker. She knew what it was. Every orc knows what it is. A tracking bone, left by a clan hunter to mark that the quarry has been found. Not a threat, not yet. A notification. The clan's way of saying, "We know where you are. We have not decided what to do about it." Ushka held the bone in her palm. It was cold and smooth and weighed almost nothing, and it was the heaviest thing she had held since the day they filed her tusks. She looked at the tree line. The dark looked back. Nothing moved. No second horn. No shape between the trunks. Just the wind, and the pines, and the cold, and the small carved bone, and the knowledge, certain, absolute, unignorable, that the Grimjaw had found her. She stood there for a long time. The cold came up through her bare feet, and she let it come. In the Grimjaw, a tracking bone meant the hunt had entered its final phase. The quarry had been located. The clan would meet, and the elders would decide what came next. Sometimes nothing came next. The quarry was judged too far, too embedded, too costly to retrieve. Sometimes the hunters came. Ushka had seen it once as a child, a Grimjaw exile found living among humans in a trading post 3 valleys east. The hunters came at night. They did not come for blood, they came for the debt. Every orc who is exiled carries a debt to the clan, and the debt does not expire, and the Grimjaw have long memories and longer patience. She did not know what she owed them. She did not know if anyone in the Grimjaw still cared enough to collect. But the bone was here, and the bone was real, and it had not placed itself at the tree line. Behind her, the farmhouse sat in the dark with its people sleeping inside it. Calden, who had crossed a street for her and given away 2 years of his life and asked her to stay. Rowan, who had fought for her in a schoolyard and sat beside her at the table and was becoming, day by day, someone she recognized. Not her son, not exactly, but something close enough that the difference did not matter. Fern, who had given her a name no one else in the world had ever given her, who slept with Pip in one arm and the other reaching toward the edge of the bed. Toward the door, toward the place where Ushka would be in the morning. She had something to lose now. That was what the bone meant. Not that the clan was coming. They might come. They might not. The Grimjaw made their own decisions in their own time. What it meant was that she was no longer the exiled orc with nothing. She was the exiled orc with a family. And a family is a weakness. And the Grimjaw understood weakness the way wolves understand a limp. She closed her fist around the bone, the carved edges pressed into her palm. She did not go back inside. She stood at the edge of the property, facing the dark trees, and her breath made clouds in the frozen air, and her feet were numb on the frozen ground, and the house behind her was warm and full of people she had not expected to love, and had not asked to love, and loved anyway. With the complete and ungovernable love of a woman who knows what it costs to have nothing and is not willing to go back. The wind came through the pines. The horn did not sound again. But it would. Ushka stood at the tree line until the cold was in her bones, and the first gray suggestion of dawn appeared on the ridge. Then she put the tracking bone in the pocket of her dress and walked back across the frozen yard and went inside and closed the door behind her. She stood in the kitchen. The stove had burned low. The house was dark and warm and still. On the shelf above the window, the sewing basket caught a sliver of early light, and the wooden lid glowed faintly, and outside the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere past the ridge a bird called once, long and unhurried. The kind of call that asks a question and does not wait for the answer. She did not go back to bed. She stood at the window with her hand in her pocket, fingers around the bone, and she looked at the tree line and she did not look away. She had been exiled once. She had been discarded once. She had been assessed and measured and found insufficient by people who did not know what sufficiency looked like because they had never had to build it from nothing. She had survived all of it, the clan, the platform, the whispers, the prepared voices, because she had nothing to lose, and a woman with nothing to lose is a woman the world cannot touch. But now she had something. Now she had a kitchen that smelled like molasses, and a boy who was learning to look at her without flinching, and a girl who called her mama, and a man who had given away his future because standing by while she was taken was not something he could be. She had a step she had mended, and a porch she had sat on, and a blanket that had been offered without being asked for, and a place at the table that was hers. And the Grimjaw were patient, and the dark was wide, and the bone in her pocket was smooth and cold and real. The house held its warmth, the family slept, and the woman at the window held them all inside the circle of her watching, and the circle was fierce, and the dark was patient, and neither of them blinked. That was the story of Ushka, a clan-banished orc who arrived with nothing but a bag and a spine, and who found, in a human kitchen in a human town, everything that actually matters. And the price of keeping it was not yet paid. Thank you for listening to this story from Orc Heart Saga. If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments, should Ushka stand and fight or run to protect them? I'll see you in the next one.